In 1991, a group of salvage divers stumbled upon a wreck lying silently at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. At first, they had no idea they were about to rewrite history. Deep inside the corroded hull of the sunken submarine lay a secret that had evaded the world for nearly half a century. It was no ordinary wreck, and it certainly wasn't just another casualty of war. This was the final resting place of U-869, a German U-boat lost during World War II. And its rediscovery would challenge the official narrative that had been accepted for decades. The dive team had been informed of the wreck's location by a charter fishing boat captain whose net had snagged on something unusually large and solid in a treacherous part of the ocean off the coast of New Jersey. He hadn't seen it, just felt it. But what lay beneath was more than a fishing hazard. It was a time capsule from one of the darkest chapters in human history. The wreck's location was ominously dangerous. Perched within a depression along the edge of the continental shelf, about 235 feet below the surface, where visibility was poor, the currents were fierce, and even the smallest mistake could prove fatal. Only the most skilled and experienced wreck divers dared to descend. But Bill Nagel, a legendary figure in deep-sea diving, was intrigued. He assembled a small elite team of fellow divers, including the renowned John Chatterton and Richie Kohler, both famous for their fearlessness and skill in exploring underwater ruins. They knew the risks, but they were driven by something greater, the possibility of uncovering a long-forgotten piece of World War II history. When the divers finally made their descent, they found what appeared to be an old German U-boat, mostly intact but covered in decades of marine growth and sediment. Artifacts recovered during the dive bore unmistakable Nazi insignia, plates, bowls, and utensils stamped with eagles and swastikas, clear indications of the vessel's origins. Yet, curiously, there were no markings to indicate which specific submarine it was. The discovery brought excitement, but also confusion. What was this German submarine doing off the coast of New Jersey? And why had it never been recorded? To unravel the mystery, one had to go back to August 25, 1941, when the construction of U-869 was ordered under the command of Captain Helmuth Neuerberg. At over 250 feet in length and equipped with 6 torpedo tubes and a 37mm quick-firing gun, the submarine was a formidable threat. It took 3 years to construct and, in that time, was equipped with modifications and upgrades that set it apart from other U-boats. Most of its crew were young recruits, men barely into adulthood, trained quickly and sent off to fight a war they barely understood. They were sailors, not spies, caught in the machinery of a global conflict that showed no mercy. U-869 was finally deployed for active duty in 1944 and received its first mission, to patrol the Atlantic Ocean. But the mission was uneventful. The U-boat encountered no enemy vessels, engaged in no battles, and delivered no torpedoes. It returned, seemingly unsuccessful but intact. Then came a second order, this time to head to the Strait of Gibraltar. But after receiving the command, the submarine vanished. There were no further communications, no logs, and no last transmissions. It simply disappeared into the depths of the sea. In the years that followed, U-869 became a footnote in naval history, presumed lost. The U.S. Navy later reported that U-869 had been destroyed off the coast of Rabat, French Morocco, by American and French naval forces. Depth charges were dropped on what was believed to be a German U-boat, and the vessel was assumed to be U-869. Based solely on circumstantial evidence and guesswork, this version of events was accepted and recorded in history books. But there was no physical proof, no wreck, no confirmed contact, and no corroboration from German records. The Navy's claim was more a story of convenience than of fact. It gave them a victory and closed the chapter on a mystery that few bothered to question, until Nagel's dive team found the actual wreck in 1991. The implications were staggering. The official account was not only incorrect, it was entirely fabricated. This wasn't a simple clerical error, it was a historical cover-up. For decades, the families of the 56 crew members who had served aboard U-869 had no closure. They mourned their sons, brothers, and fathers without knowing where they had died or how. Now, their remains rested in a submarine grave just off the U.S. coastline, a fact obscured by a fabricated tale of naval heroism. The discovery brought those truths back to light. But at great cost. The divers who undertook the mission faced immense dangers. Some would lose their lives in the process. The currents were merciless, the depth unforgiving, and the mystery itself seemed cursed. Still, the team pressed on. They recovered artifacts, documented the wreck, and slowly pieced together a more accurate version of what happened. But questions remained. Why did U-869 end up off the coast of New Jersey? Had it disobeyed orders? Was it rerouted for a secret mission? Was it operating under radio silence for espionage reasons? Theories abounded. Some suggested that U-869 had been sent to sabotage American ports or shipping lanes. Others believed it might have been a decoy or involved in a secret operation lost to history. One thing was clear: this wasn't a simple navigational error. The submarine had ended up thousands of miles from its last known command location without explanation. As further dives were conducted, the team uncovered evidence that U-869 had likely been destroyed by one of its own torpedoes. The theory was that the sub had fired at a nearby target, only for the torpedo to circle back and strike the hull, a phenomenon not unheard of with early torpedo technology. If true, it would explain the lack of enemy engagement and the absence of a distress call. It also meant the submarine's demise was tragic but accidental, a cruel twist of fate for the young men aboard. This theory, combined with the Discovery's location, shattered the myth propagated for decades. U-869 had never been in Morocco. It had died alone, in silence, off the coast of the very country it was meant to attack. As the story of U-869 spread, it reignited debates among historians, naval experts, and wartime analysts. Books were written. Documentaries were filmed. And the brave divers who risked everything to bring the truth to light became folk heroes in their own right. The wreck of U-869 remains a solemn reminder of the cost of war, not just in lives, but in lost truths. And though many questions may never be answered, the Discovery gave voice to a story that history tried to forget. In the end, the submarine that was once erased from the records now speaks louder than ever from its watery grave. The mystery surrounding U-869 didn't end with its discovery. Instead, it raised even more questions about wartime strategy, government accountability, and the silent heroes of deep-sea exploration. As historians, divers, and researchers began to study the wreck in greater detail, they uncovered anomalies that didn't quite align with the conventional expectations for a typical wartime patrol. For example, various tools and equipment found on board suggested that the submarine had been modified, perhaps even retrofitted, for a specific, undisclosed mission. There were rumors, though never confirmed, that some compartments had been sealed in ways inconsistent with standard operational procedure. It made people wonder, what was this submarine really doing so close to American shores? The idea of secret Nazi missions along the east coast of the United States isn't far-fetched. In fact, during World War II, several German U-boats were caught attempting to land saboteurs on American soil. Operation Pastorius, one of Hitler's lesser-known plans, involved German agents coming ashore in New York and Florida, tasked with destroying infrastructure and creating chaos. The mission ultimately failed, but it revealed that Nazi Germany was not only willing but actively attempting to breach U.S. defenses. In that light, the idea that U-869 had a covert role to play becomes more plausible. It might have been carrying agents, equipment, or experimental weaponry. Or perhaps it was simply sent to observe shipping patterns and relay intelligence, though no one could confirm it now. Whatever the purpose, the truth died with the crew. And it's that human element that gives the story of U-869 its haunting resonance. The men aboard weren't faceless enemies. They were young, many of them barely out of school, conscripted into a brutal conflict they likely didn't fully understand. The average age of a U-boat crewman during the war was just 20. Imagine being 20 years old, deep under the ocean, thousands of miles from home, knowing that a silent death could come at any moment from a depth charge, a torpedo, or, as it appears in U-869's case, a tragic mechanical failure. The likelihood that U-869 was sunk by its own torpedo is particularly cruel. Torpedoes of that era, especially the German T-5 acoustic torpedoes, were known to malfunction. In some cases, they would lock onto the very submarine that fired them, especially during abrupt course changes or if countermeasures failed. If this was indeed the case with U-869, it means the crew was undone not by enemy action but by the very weapon they had hoped would ensure their success and survival. Following its identification, U-869 became the subject of the acclaimed book Shadow Divers by Robert Kurson, which detailed the harrowing experiences of Chatterton and Kohler during their multi-year quest to prove the submarine's identity. The book was more than a dive log. It was a human story, about obsession, risk, and the emotional toll of seeking truth in the most dangerous environments imaginable. The divers themselves went through physical danger and psychological strain. At one point, team members disagreed so fiercely on the identity and mission of the sub that it threatened to tear their project apart. But ultimately, through rigorous research and repeated dives, they uncovered key pieces of evidence, including a knife engraved with a crew member's name and a builder's plate that finally confirmed the sub as U-869. Their work helped correct the official record. U.S. naval archives were updated, and the story of the U-boat's misidentification was acknowledged. Germany, too, took note, with military historians adding the corrected information to their own wartime databases. For the families of the lost crew, it was a moment of belated recognition. Letters and memorials were exchanged across continents, bridging a gap of decades and bringing an odd sort of peace. Even the divers expressed a solemn respect for the men they had found, former enemies, yes,